how it shaped that is it makes you very good at reading a room. You become over-tuned to other people and how they might be receiving you and how you're receiving them. But I think in terms of leadership, and if we think about leadership in all areas of life, that's definitely been a part of that. And sensing also other people who are similar to me. I don't really know what this looks like and why am I feeling this way when I've always pushed myself out there. I've always been an extreme extrovert. So that's, I think it's definitely still a process, but I would say very recently that's come to light, as it were.
Just talk to us a little bit about that in terms of getting to that point. Was it people around you telling you, look, you've got to look at this differently, or was there some event that actually made or triggered you in that way to think, no, I need to change?
Everything, that phrase, everything blooms in its own time, everything grows in its own time. We have different seasons, we can't predict the weather, was a really beneficial thing to do, was a really beneficial way through that, because I was still I couldn't just stop.
Hello, and welcome to Confessions of a Successful Leader, hosted by me, Andrew Tallents, the self-coaching expert. In each episode of the show, we hear the insightful confessions of a successful leader who wants to inspire others to live their professional and personal dreams. I am always keen to hear your feedback, particularly in relation to the kinds of leaders you would like me to invite onto the show in future. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the rich insights from our special guest. Hello and welcome to another episode of Confessions of a Successful Leader, hosted by me, Andrew Tallents, the self-coaching expert. I'm delighted to say that Leyla Okhai has joined me in the studio today. Leyla, welcome.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's a huge pleasure to be on your show today.
Thank you. Well, everyone that listens to this or watches this will know we start with getting to know our guest a little bit first. So just tell us a bit about who you are and where your current focus is.
Yeah, so thank you. As you said, my name's Leyla and my business is Diverse Minds UK Limited, and I do work on race equity and very practical workplace mental well-being and the bit where they meet in the middle. So how do we look at mental health models of recovery, where work comes in and has a focus on culture and racism, and where racism impacts negatively on mental well-being. And I do that through coaching, training, consultancy and speaking.
Super. And when you're not doing all that, what do you do outside of work?
Yeah, so what do I do outside of work? This is a really great question because I've been thinking about it a lot recently. I do spend a lot of my time cleaning and cooking and gardening, and other bits and bobs and hobbies. And I run a local book group, a feminist book group with my friends. And I learn languages and I do other bits and bobs. But yeah, that's my work focus.
Great. And what's the book at the moment in the reading station?
We are reading Ocean Vuong's On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. So I finished that. It's a real heart-wrencher of a book, actually. I recommend it, but it's not for the faint-hearted.
Oh, okay, I'll have to make a note of that. And I've just started getting into cooking recently. So what's your signature dish if you were to cook your favourite meal?
Yeah, I don't think I have a signature dish. So I have lots and lots of cookbooks, and it's one of those things, it's a bit like jewellery. When you wear jewellery or you have cookbooks or you have scarves, people buy you more and more. So I have a whole shelf, actually a shelf plus like a really big deep shelf in my kitchen, in my dining room, full of cookbooks. So I pick and choose, I do different things. I mean, there's quick and easy things that I do. And then there's longer things, like if I have a lot of time and it's a very special occasion, I can make paneer biryani and I can do things like that. But that's not a daily dish that I make because it takes too long.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing that. And when we start the podcast and go into the actual content of what's been coming up, it's really useful for, again, the audience just to understand the context. So let's start about, your earlier childhood experiences, how they informed, you think, your early leadership style.
Yeah, so I think, if people have heard me talk before, something I always talk about is being an inside outsider, like not really belonging to the in-groups and sort of having one foot in, one foot out. And what do I mean by that? So I am East African Asian. I was born in the States and I moved to the UK when I was 9. So I've never really felt like I've had, and I didn't grow up in my community either. So this is the thing. I've always been I'm very adaptable because I've had to be, because I haven't really sat in one area or been I think part of one clear community, unlike many of my other South Asian colleagues and friends, and Black friends and colleagues as well. So I think in terms of leadership then, what how it shaped that is it makes you very good at reading a room. You become over tuned to other people and how they might be receiving you and how you're receiving them. But I think in terms of leadership, and if we think about leadership in all areas of life, that's definitely been a part of that. And sensing also other people who are similar to me. So they might also be inside outsiders. And there's a real camaraderie, and also being able to, as part of my leadership journey, elevate those people who feel similarly.
Sure. So let's go back then to the earlier recognition that that was serving you, because as I found with many of my guests, that kind of superpower, that strength is very useful until a certain point. Then we realize it's not always helpful necessarily in certain situations. So what was it for you? What was that inflection point?
Yeah, so I think one of the things is around boundaries, and they look very different depending on cultural context. And I think in the global north and white Western culture, it's very much around, well, if you don't like it, draw a line, that's your boundary, and get on with it. Well, actually, in South Asian culture, it's very, very different because it is collective and you do put other people first. And I know you'll have a sense of this as well, Andrew, because you've worked in different cultural contexts. So you can't really do that. And it's very, very difficult because it's always about the collective. So I think a very hard lesson for me to learn. And also, I think there's something about the balance between servant leadership and your own well-being, and where that line is, and finding that line. So I think there was a phase, particularly where I worked at Imperial College London, which was a brilliant experience, but I was always on, and I was always trying to support disabled staff. I was always trying to do things, and actually it probably was helpful, but what it did do is it took responsibility away from people to a certain extent. And it was, I think, being over helpful, as we know, can sometimes not be super helpful for people and empowering. So that's been a very difficult and long lesson to learn. And it's still definitely a process. But yeah, so I think it's that thing around being so attuned to others, you forget about yourself and what you're feeling in that moment. So your body might be speaking to you, but you might not be able to interpret those signals.
Absolutely. And did you have any education around the time about sort of self well-being in that sense and looking after self? What kind of age did it come to you in terms of that kind of educational support or knowledge?
Yeah, I think we all get the memo about eating well and exercising and sleeping. So that, that's okay. That was always there. But I think really I think it's only when I hit 40, which was 2 years ago, is unpicking all of this. Like, what do boundaries actually mean? The way that Western culture asks of you to do it, or says do this and just draw the line and move on. It's not possible. And so what does that look like, and what does that feel like? So I don't think I'm there yet. I think it's still definitely a process. But yeah, it really sort of hit me like a train, if I can use that. And I don't mean that sort of disrespectfully, actually. That's not a great phrase. It hit me severely when certain things happened in life that made me think, wow, I really can't keep going like this. And at what point is I think it was, after COVID, and there was a whole tension in me about feeling like, oh, I should be visible. I need to be more visible. I need to be more visible in my business. And also just thinking, I really can't. I'm just really exhausted. So that light bulb, but also really harsh light bulb. So it's not a nice soft glow. It's a horrible strip light being shined on you. And you're thinking, I don't really know what this looks like, and why am I feeling this way when I've always pushed myself out there? I've always been an extreme extrovert. So yeah, I think it's definitely still a process, but I would say very recently that's come to light, as it were.
And it's great that we've got you at this point where it's fresh in that sense. There's going to be many people that can relate to this sort of feeling towards the end of that, hold on a minute, I need to stop. So just talk to us a little bit about that in terms of getting to that point. Was it people around you telling you, look, you've got to look at this differently? Or was there some event that actually made or triggered you in that way to think, no, I need to change?
Yeah, I think sometimes, so it was definitely an event. It wasn't people around me, because I think we still weren't seeing many people at that point because it was the aftermath of lockdown. So this is going to sound very strange, but one of the things that I'd always aimed for was to kind of have this forever home, because I've moved around quite a lot. So there was a point where we finally got to the point where we bought this house, which was bigger, and we were really happy. Some work had to be done on it, and anyone who's had work done on their house knows it's a real roller coaster ride. It wasn't lots, but it took its toll. Then we moved in, and I sat down and I was like, I don't want to be here anymore. I want to go back to the old house. And it was just really weird, and I couldn't put my finger on it, and I couldn't put my finger on it, and I couldn't, and I was like, why am I feeling this way? This is what I've wanted, and blah, 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 blah. And I think that often when we are pushed in, Western society to strive, set your goals, you get there. And athletes talk about this, actually. A lot of Olympians have spoken about this, that you get somewhere and then suddenly it's not just that it's an anticlimax. And I think I had to unpick that what it subconsciously meant to me was I thought I'd get this house and I'd have the community that I never had. I'd have the family that I never had. And it would all come together. Now, of course, when I say it like that, someone might think, well, that's incredibly naive. But it wasn't conscious. It was this thing about you get the house, things are sorted, your life's sorted, you can move on. And actually, it wasn't the reverse. It was just such a shock of going, actually, no, it's okay. I know I can do it now. I really want to go back. I want to go back to where I feel safe and where I feel there's a place of striving. And so when you've saved since you were 14 years old for a house and then suddenly you get it, it's a bit overwhelming. And then you think, oh, well, this is just the same, but a bit bigger and a bit nicer. So I think that was really interesting. It just sounds so silly when I say it, but yeah, it's part of the leadership journey, isn't it?
It is, and let's move on from that. So obviously that then hit you, and then the realization about that. That's sometimes very difficult to lift ourselves out of that. And again, it's the people around us that can support us with that. So what happened there then in terms of the next steps around that?
Well, it took a very long time. It took a very long time trying to work out, okay, well, what actually do I want? What do I do? What are my motivations? And the motivation did drain out of me completely. And it was a process of using collage, actually, that got me out of it. So using collage, and I'm trained in collage as a coaching tool as a result of that. So I worked with a brilliant arts counselor called Rebecca, and she would just set me small tasks and I would do collages every time. So I think I saw her for 6 weeks and we would unpick these collages. And I still have them here. I have them on my desk just in the background to remind me. And so we unpicked those. And then I found out about the work of Andrea Watts, and she's the founder of the collage coaching technique. And I trained with her and I unpicked it that way. So for me, it was often, people say, talk about it, talk about how you feel, but I really didn't have the words for it. And I think that I just took back some old cereal packets. I'm a bit of a magazine keeper. I love magazines. So I had all these magazines at home and I would just put on some music and I would just create these collages, like A4, not very big. And really just then use them as a prompt to think about what is this trying to communicate to me. And it's okay not to know the answers. So it took a long time. It took about 18 months to kind of digest and process everything that was going on. And I think it's still going on. I don't think it's completely reconciled, but it enabled me to unpick a lot of those feelings and sensations and thoughts. Also listening to audiobooks like Radical Acceptance by Tara Brach, which is one of my favorite books. I recently just listened to Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown, and I didn't know what I was going to make of it, but brilliant again to, unpick things. And it's a very accessible book. So it's those sorts of things just constantly. It was about stopping doing, actually, and just looking and using the senses in a different way.
Oh, I'm glad you said that. Probably many of the people we come across in life have this concept about the fact I need to move from doing to being, and therefore being in relationship with myself and others. And it's such a hard journey to go in that sense. So just tell us a bit more about that, because you're absolutely relating to, I think, what I understand around this, just stopping. And it's okay to stop, and it's okay just to be in the moment and not worry about what that actually means. What's happened for you in the last sort of 18 months around that?
Yeah, I think one of the other things, it's very, very difficult if you identify. I mean, I think it's difficult for many people for many different reasons, but if I can speak from my perspective, it's been extra difficult for me because being from a diaspora community, if we want to use the word immigrant, which has become a very strange word to use, but from my immigrant experience is very different to a lot of my friends and colleagues. My family didn't work in factories. They were very sort of upper middle class. They had a lot of financial privilege, which interestingly hasn't really been passed on to me. That's another story. But whereas I have lots of friends whose, their fathers in particular worked on the railways, their parents did double shifts in bread factories. So that's not my story. And I think that, but despite the fact that's not my story, I think one of the things that many of us have, if we identify with diaspora journey in any way, is if it's not hard and it's not painful and it's not grueling, you're not doing it right. And so it's very difficult for a lot of people to stop. But I think particularly for South Asian immigrant families, diaspora families, it's that if we stop, we lose time. If we lose time, we lose money. And it's not about greed, but it's about how do we then look after ourselves and our future, because we know that the government aren't going to do it, or there isn't the money there necessarily. And so it becomes quite a frightening place, actually. So it's not very easy. So a lot of the messaging around self-care, the commercialized messages around self-care, they feel very self-indulgent, they feel very weird, they feel very counterintuitive. Now, I do think that's also generational. I think it sits differently with younger South Asians than it does with sort of my generation and generations above. But it just felt very hard to stop, because the other message I'd had throughout my life was like, you mustn't be lazy, you have to be industrious, you have to keep working, you have to do this. So then to stop, it's like, how do you reconcile the fact that your body's screaming at you, just take a break, it's okay, with this whole cultural messaging from society, you've got to keep going, productivity, etc., etc. So I think part of that was about, so with this house that we moved into, it has a really big garden, and like has raised beds, it has a greenhouse, like it's like it is really amazing, but it was also really overwhelming. So my husband said to me, look, you're not feeling great. He said, why don't you just pick a patch of the garden and just go into the garden, like do whatever you want, like he's like, you don't have to do it if you don't want to, but I'm making a suggestion, like maybe that will make you feel a bit better, like you just don't know. He like, how would you feel willing to give it a go? And I was like, yeah, actually that is a really good idea. So I just started. I mean, it was quite well established, bits of it, but then bits of it sort of, weeds come in, and if you don't do it, blah, blah, blah. So I just started with certain patches, and I started weeding, and I started doing things, and I started sowing some seeds. And I think that really was a way of, you are in stillness, because it's frustrating. Like I'll plant seeds, and even though, of course, I know this isn't the case, I want them to spring up the next day, and that doesn't happen, like good germination is 7 days to get a little seedling, depending on the plant. So that was a way of stopping, but also doing something. And the lessons that nature teaches you about the pace of things, and you can read it on memes, you can read it on Instagram, you can read it in gardening books, and that's valuable. But I think when you do it yourself, it's actually really tells you that you are doing things, but you're not rushing things. And the space, everything, that phrase, everything blooms in its own time, everything grows in its own time. We have different seasons, we can't predict the weather, was a really beneficial thing to do, was a really beneficial way through that, because I couldn't just stop. It's like, it is in a sense, and not to trivialize it in any way, shape or form, but we kind of demonize substance misuse, but it's not really that different, being very intrinsically and overly involved in work or whatever you're doing. It is a kind of misuse of, whatever.
I agree. And I connected with the fact that my attachment style is a dismissive avoidant, which is quite troublesome when you've got 3 kids and 2 wives, second one now. But that was really interesting when I became aware of that. The fact I was running away from a lot of things, working very hard, traveling hard, and then being in relationship for short periods. But I recognized that was also linked to the trauma that my mother had when she was a child. But this was all through therapy and dealing with that. So I'm just interested in your view, from your perspective and your life story so far, what you think about Gabor Mate's view from his Myth of Normal work around the fact that we're born with intergenerational trauma, and therefore if we can accept that and channel it in a different way, we can live life in a different way.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you've asked me that, because I was talking about this with a friend who has Bengali heritage, and we were talking about cholesterol and this whole thing about, cholesterols in South Asians. And I said to her, you know what? I said, we have slightly higher cholesterol, and we were talking about the fact that I think personally diabetes, everyone's obsessed with diet. Now, of course, we know diet plays a part. We know we shouldn't eat lots of sugar, but that's across all cultures. And I think a lot of diabetes personally comes from trauma. And she said, yeah, absolutely. And she said, one of the reasons we could have elevated cholesterol, I read an article about it, is because of the famines many of us were subjected to. And of course, Bengalis experienced huge amount of famine. It was the anniversary this year. And I just went, wow, yeah, you're absolutely right. So then we were talking about intergenerational trauma, and I think you're absolutely right. I think we do have that. And I think many of us, we know snippets of our stories. We don't know the whole story. Many of us can't trace our families back because there wasn't paperwork, or the paperwork's been hidden, so yes, I definitely agree with that. And the whole study around epigenetics and how it's passed on. So what are the ways in which we can also look to our roots, however we define our roots, in terms of the healing process as well. And this is why I think, food is so important in South Asian culture, but it's also the process of making the food. I think is part of the therapy. It's not called therapy, and people would balk at you if you called that, but it is part of that. You're busy, but you're actually in sync. You're actually in flow. You're creating quite amazing foods. You're using spices that are linked to heritage that all have a healing property. Every single thing that we use in South Asian food has a benefit to the body. So, yeah, I think that is a way to do things, and I do agree with that. About the trauma point. I mean, there's some people that don't really have as much trauma, but then we don't know because we don't go right back to the origins of our kind of families.
No. I think it'd be great to get your insight as well. I deal with a lot of clients who are, of Western heritage in the sense of very much I context. So it goes opposite to the point you were saying about community and collaboration. So I'll be really interested in your insight in terms of what people in the West particularly can learn in terms of on that journey from I to we to us and the benefits and value of going on that journey.
Mm. Yeah, and I think it's a very difficult one because how do you identify if it's your main culture and it's
Yeah.
intrinsic and it's implicit to you? So I think one of the things is to think about how, and I get people to do this when I do workshops on cultural awareness. I say, how do you define your culture? So think about what defines your culture. And I've had people say to me, well, I'm just normal white British. And I said, okay, could you kindly explain that to me? I'd really love to know what that means. And she went, oh. Yeah, because we know there's a big north-south divide. We know there's, Scottish culture is very specific, Welsh culture is very specific, where in Wales you're from, all of that. So I think people need to think about what is there, how they define their culture, then your family culture, your career history and cultures that you've worked in, and thinking about, well, what's the benefits of moving from an I to a we, and what are the ways in which you could do that? So to me, this is also linked up in boundaries, right? Because it's like, well, no, I'm being boundaried. I is very boundaried. It's very helpful in that context. But when does it need to shift slightly to accommodate? Because they're rigid boundaries. And then there's also thinking about, well, yeah, they're personal limits, but there's also opening the door to a different way of doing things. I think it's very difficult. And I think for me, it's part of the colonial legacy was very I. It wasn't about the we. So how do you shift that narrative? And if you think about, I've not seen them in real life, but I watched a very fascinating program about the terracotta warriors and how they were made. And on each terracotta warrior and each implement of war that they've all got these codes on who they were made, who the line manager was effectively, and it traces back to that collectivism that you get in Chinese culture and how these cultures are really hard baked. Because if we then go from the terracotta warriors to the way in which, not always, it wasn't ideal, and I know a lot of people suffered, but the way in which China as a huge big country were able to get people to stay at home for the benefit of others. And when you heard Chinese people speaking about it, saying, well, I understand why I have to do this for the benefit of other people. It's for the benefit of my country. Whereas if you saw it like in America and the UK, it was completely the opposite. And eventually, of course, people in China were very upset and angry and there were things going on. But yeah, I think it's about observation and thinking about the way that we do things is the way we do things. Let's think about the alternatives and other ways, and where could the we be beneficial in this context?
Love that. And I want to go back to Leyla as a 9-year-old, and obviously you described in terms of that. And can you reflect now, if I was to ask you, what was the essence of Leyla as a 9-year-old in terms of all that opportunity that lay ahead for her? And we'll talk about your future in a little while. But what was the essence of you as a 9-year-old?
Do you know, I can't really remember to be honest, because I think I just moved from the US to the UK. Everything felt very culturally different. It was very difficult. Things were very difficult to navigate culturally, even though, the language was the same and you could argue certain things. I don't really know because I think I've blocked a lot of it out. Sorry, I can't answer that one very effectively. But I can tell you I was always into reading. I was always into learning. I always loved to do puzzles. Um, I always had this big imagination. So yeah, those are the things I can remember.
No, absolutely. And I'm just really interested because of the collage that released you in terms of that period that you're talking
Yeah.
about. Was that an interest when you were a child as well in terms of art? And were you into art then? Or?
I loved art. I wasn't good at it. Like But yeah, I loved to draw. I mean, most children do, don't they? Collage in particular. It's always paper craft has always been a bit of a thing. So I used to love origami. I love paper. I love different types of paper, Japanese paper. I think someone might have bought me something, and I remember playing with paper a lot. So yeah, that's probably the connection. And also I'm a very I don't like details. I like big picture stuff. So when you can just grab different things, and my mind makes connections. So I'll be listening to a song, and then I'll think about the artist. I'll be like, oh, I wonder where they are. Then I'll start reading about them, then I'll go into a rabbit hole. So I think collage is really useful to do that. You can just go into rabbit holes, and it doesn't have to make sense, and then you can look at it and say, you know, what's the subconscious trying to tell me, or what do I want to make of this, or how could it help me in this context?
There's a great book that I read a few years ago, and I think I'm going to get the title right. It's by Robert Fritz, and I think it's called The Path of Least
The Path of
Resistance.
Least Resistance. Yeah, I haven't
Love
read
that
it,
book.
but yeah, I really want to read it, and I've just saved it as an audiobook. And funnily enough, I was having a conversation a few months ago with a friend, and I said, Nina Kuipers from Black in Menopause sent me a beautiful email one day and said to me, I said, oh, I'm really struggling. I'm just taking the path of least resistance. And she emailed me back and she said, the path of least resistance, Leyla, is still a path. And then I was telling my friend this, and she went, oh my gosh, and she lifted that book and she was like, look at what I'm reading. So that's really strange that you've just said that again. Yeah.
It's got to. Well, what I love about it is because I think many people that are listening to this and watching this would probably resonate a little bit, saying, well, I liked being creative when I was a child, but I wasn't particularly good at it. And a lot of us would say that, and yet it's actually a natural gift for all of us. And I think what I love about his work is whatever it manifests as for us in terms of our creativity, if we just leave it to fester and just to be, then as you say, it will actually appear as something that will benefit us and is there for us to enjoy later on. So yeah, I'm glad you're related to that. That's lovely. Before we come to your future, I definitely want to come to your future. It's very important. What other insights come to mind now, bear in mind what we've already talked about, that would be useful for our listeners and audience to understand about what you've learned about the challenges of leadership and what things you've had to overcome until now?
Yeah, I think, well, just want to pick up on your creativity point. The other book that's really useful is The Artist's Way,
Yeah, I love
by,
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, Julia Cameron. That's an interesting book, and I kind of got to chapter 8 and got a bit stuck, but I loved that too. Yes, and then in terms of lessons of leadership, um, I think that I think the word leadership is an interesting one now because of the way it's used and overused in the context. And I think in workplaces, in traditional workplaces, it's very much these people at the top are leaders, you all are workers, and I really hate that. And so one of the things that I used to try and do with my team is to say, you know what, you all have leadership capabilities, you're all doing leadership work. How do you want to exercise that leadership? And this idea that, you know, the ideal leader has done, you know, 25,000 courses, is very senior, has been to Oxbridge, all these things that really, really grate on me. So I think having seen that in the workplace, I really try and push against that. I think the other thing is just around the inequity that you see in traditional workplaces, and the power grabbing and the dog eat dogness for what. And I think one of the things then that has taught me is it's very easy to get caught up in that. It's much easier to step away when you have your own business, but I think when you're in it because that's the system. But there have been many times where, you know, I've heard stories of bullying or what people have been doing, and I've sort of turned around to a colleague and said, wow, you know, are they going to put this on their headstone? I worked 12-hour days and bullied people, and that's my legacy. And so, you know, and then the point around legacy is another interesting one, because I was reading an email that Tara Moore from California, who is the author of Playing Big, she talks about this Silicon Valley, and there's this concept of making a dent in the universe. And I read that and I thought, oh, flipping heck, you know, who do we think we are? That really bothered me, because there's leaving a legacy and there's leaving a positive impact, and making a dent in the universe. That sounds very destructive, actually. So I think that's the thing with leadership, isn't it? And as we lead in our own lives, and I'm not a parent, but I do think parenthood is the biggest leadership role that anyone will play, or being a mentor, you know, or having young people in your life. And so it's not that we want to leave a dent, an indelible mark. And when I think of dent, I think of dented cars and damage, but it's what's the legacy so that people remember, you know, a kind word that you asked them, or the way in which you spoke to them, or you said something around, we should go for it, just go for it and see what happens. And it's those things that I think are really the key with leadership. Or when you're at a bus stop or you're at a train. I remember when I was on a train and train disasters and there was no water, and then this stranger just bought me a bottle of water from nowhere. So those for me are real leadership moments, and then we can learn from that, because I think that when I started my career, it was all about, I've got to get really senior in higher education. This is my sector and I really want to do it. And then you get to a point, I think, where you look around and you go, wow, I don't want to be like any of these people. It's time for me to exit, and that's okay.
What I love about that is what a lot of people struggle with when on the verge of actually being in a corporate and moving to be an entrepreneur or even an entrepreneur as a stage to that is, I'm being valued and paid for being an expert. And then suddenly when I move into this where I'm leading experts or leading others, I'm not anymore. I'm being paid to lead. And that's quite scary because I've got nothing to fall back on anymore.
Yes. And I tell you what the biggest challenge for me was, and you are going to laugh, Andrew, was I was terrified about my email address. So I had an @imperial.ac.uk email address, right? So that for me was really, really full of clout. And I remember saying to my dear friend, Janet Morgan, I said, but Janet, what am I going to do? I don't have an @imperial.ac.uk email address. And she looked at me, she went, Leyla, don't be ridiculous. It's still you. It's just a different ending. She was like, who's not going to work with you? But those things feel really, really real to you. And I wasn't scared about things not to fall back on, because I think my main motivation for starting a business was the autonomy, was the freedom, and was not having a line manager. That was the really exciting bit for me.
Yeah, I'm the same as you, Leyla. I'm the same as you. That brings us to your future. And obviously you've been on a journey. You've kindly shared with us, that difficult period as well when you moved to the house and what you've worked through there. But in terms of where you are right now, what you're going to be in service of in the coming years, just share that with our audience.
Yeah, it's a great question, Andrew, and I wish I had a really straightforward answer for you. I'm trying really hard to take it day by day. So I guess in terms of the future, this year I've taken a 2-day-a-week job with Hatch Enterprise. I did an accelerator program with them last year, so I've been coordinating a community of practice for them called the Collective Leadership Group. So we'll be finishing that in January, but obviously we've still got time, and so it's working with social enterprise sector and with social enterprise practitioners to support other founders. So that's quite exciting, and learning more about that sector, and learning more about our founders. So I've been a bit of a dragon and sitting on some pitch things, so that's been really interesting. I think my podcast has gone down to fortnightly for various reasons, but I think that's the right move after 5 years of weekly. So to carry on doing the podcast, that's definitely in my future. And then I think it's around really focusing on interesting, challenging work. So there's intricate problems and challenges that organizations have around race equity, mental well-being. People were rejoicing about the election results, which, I can understand it. I was relieved. I wasn't rejoicing. But then we saw these horrific racist fascist riots happen, and there is a lot of aftermath. There is a lot of work to be done in that area, so I think that's obviously going to continue to be a focus. And then there's the global piece around, I might not be able to travel and go places right now, but this whole idea of how do we build peace in our daily lives and spread that peace around, and thinking about small actions we can take on a daily basis, whether it's writing to our MPs, whether it's sharing something, whether it's raising awareness about injustices that are happening on home turf and around the globe.
Super. And if there's people out there that are interested in what you've talked about today and they want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to get in touch?
Yeah, perfect. So my website is diverseminds.co.uk. I'm on LinkedIn, Leyla, Leyla Okhai, Okhai. You can LinkedIn, and then my email is Leyla, Leyla @diverseminds.co.uk. And my podcast's available on wherever you listen to your podcast from, wherever you get Andrew's podcast from. You'll find me there. It's Diverse Minds UK podcast.
Excellent. It's a great listen as well. So, Leyla, I really appreciate everything you've shared today. It's been really, really interesting for me to get to know you more as well. I'm sure all the audience have taken nuggets for them to take away. So, once again, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Andrew. It's been a real pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Confessions of a Successful Leader. You can access all previous episodes of the show at confessionsofaSuccessfulLeader.com. If you are interested in finding out more about conscious leadership and self-coaching, just type in Andrew Tallents into LinkedIn or your favorite browser, and you'll find my contact details and all the content that you need. Until next time, don't forget to stay present, curious, and above all, conscious.